So, very quick and dirty introduction to this. We don't study dinosaurs. Everyone asks me this all the time. It's quite annoying. But we do study the human past through material remains. First and foremost, this discipline is a destructive process. So I really want to emphasize the importance of context and provenience with these artifacts. It's pretty logical, but if you take something out of the ground, it loses all of its context. So that's why there's methodologies and research designs that are so important to have in place in order to understand where these things came from, time period. So I just want to emphasize that you can't put back together a site once it's gone and taken out of the ground. But because of this kind of destructive process, over the years, archaeology has kind of been looked a little bit as a colonizer effort, which in recent years has really been multiple efforts in the discipline to really reverse these issues. So new things that are coming out of this discipline are collaborative efforts with Indigenous groups, really letting the Indigenous groups run their own projects, trying to facilitate projects that benefit their communities, and then the public archaeology, which is also kind of involving communities and stakeholders. And that has been a really fun part of what I do right now, is being involved in these efforts to essentially right some wrongs. So this is a lot. We are governed under federal and state laws, as well as municipal regulations. But it's a very complicated process, so I tried to kind of streamline it a little bit. But the overarching law that we run under is Section 106. It's the National Historic Preservation Act that was enacted in 1966, and it has very strict stipulations on how to handle and process cultural resources that are going to be impacted by specifically federal undertakings. So there's 106, 101, 110, and that ensures that there's a state historic preservation officer within each state. There's also a tribal historic preservation officer on tribal lands. And then there's the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which runs under 36 CFR 800. And this is to ensure the protection of cultural resources, which include these 5 terms that are up there. And they have their own subset of laws. It's a little complicated, but when you work for the state, it kind of all, meshes together at one point. So basically, you want to determine if there's going to be an adverse effect to these resources, and if they are, then what is the evaluation of this resource's significance, and then the process kind of snowballs into different phases, which I'll get into. Each state has its own laws and regulations. I can speak on New England, and we have very strict laws to protect these resources, so there's a real check and balance in place. And the municipal regulations, there also are some towns that have bylaws that protect these archaeological resources. So there is a town in Massachusetts that's heavily involved in their protection of resources, and sometimes private land is included in this, which actually has helped for planning purposes in this town and benefited it greatly. Artifacts themselves are to be curated in a certain way based on state and federal laws, as well as the land in which they come from. And this is just an example of us out in the field doing some phase 1 testing on a transmission line. So, brings me to my next point. There is a great importance in preserving, restoring, and conservation efforts. I am a registered professional archaeologist based on my master's degree, and so there's a code of ethics that I run under, and this code has been great to follow. You can even call out other archaeologists if you see something shady going on, which has been really nice. So we kind of are a community of people who check each other. There's also other organizations that have their own code of ethics. But I think preservation is extremely important because it really does amplify individuals and communities that have been so long marginalized. So it's been really great to work together with communities to try to really give people a different perspective on narratives that have been coming across as very inaccurate throughout time. Also, it just gives you a better perspective on humans as a whole. It makes you more empathetic, understanding, and this is not just archaeology. Anthropology in itself has been really great to open the different lenses and perspectives that you see. There's a huge economic benefit to what we do. There's been jobs that have opened up, there have been tax credits, and essentially does just benefit the future generations. And so what is CRM? So CRM ultimately in itself is a little different than academic archaeology. We're here to identify, study, preserve, and manage the cultural resources that are in the ground. So basically it contributes to the mitigation and protection of significant cultural deposits, and CRM is federally mandated. This differs from a lot of things that people are probably more aware of in terms of academic-based archaeology, where site is already known for the most part. Sometimes there's research designs, but a site is already known, and a professor and their team will go out and actually have a lot of time to excavate a site. CRM is really fast-paced, and clients are not happy sometimes if things are pushed along. So it's great it's federally mandated, because some people will try to push it a little bit. This is an example of a shovel test pit. This is what we do in New England. Normally, they're this 50 by 50 centimeter that go down a sterile subsoil. So if we don't hit any artifacts and we're going down the soil horizons and we don't hit anything and it goes to something called the sea horizon, we stop and move on. This pit went down to 1 meter because it's on a floodplain, but normally they go down, they're pretty shallow, so you just move along. Out west, the soil deposition is quite limited, so you don't have to do these test pits all the time. Usually it's a pedestrian survey and everything is surface level. So out here, it's a very labor-intensive process for the most part. So in practice, what does this look like? People always ask me, what do I do on a day-to-day basis, which always varies, but for the most part, if a project falls on my desk, we'll do something called a desktop analysis and review, which consists of a ton of background research, inventory logs. We look at land use history, historical mapping, and we kind of coalesce this into one document for the client and for the TIPOs and SHPOs. So we will make our recommendations based as professionals on what they should do to this parcel of land. A lot of our work is transmission lines out here, so that's the majority of the pictures you guys are going to be seeing. But ultimately, if we do have cause for concern or the SHPOs or TIPOs disagree with our recommendations, they will come back and ask for something that, along the lines of a reconnaissance survey, which is all surficial observation, and sometimes it consists of a small site visit to check out if the landform is exactly what we thought it would be and sensitive, and if not, then we'll go back and make a decision. In Massachusetts, you have to apply for a permit for this kind of work. Other states, not so sure. I don't think you really have to. Mass is a pretty uptight state about that. So we will do something called a reconnaissance potentially, or we'll skip right to something called an intensive survey, which means essentially absence and presence testing, and that is the shovel test that I showed you, and that's what these folks are working on in New Hampshire. And usually it just happens with a quite simple research design. Again, varies state by state. I also should note these kinds of phases, the sub tasks that are associated with them do vary depending on region. So out west has a much different terminology than what I'm using. Phase 2 testing, though, goes into something called a site exam survey. So say we do find an artifact that we think is potentially significant, and there's features associated with it, we will recommend something called a site exam, which essentially adds upon our prior research with questions about it. We need to identify boundaries. If, say, they're putting a transmission line pole in a specific area, they can't remove it. We need to identify exactly where this site is spatially. After all that data is collected, then we would do something called an evaluation of significance. So archaeological sites can be on the National Register of Historic Places, and this kind of facilitates phase 3. So if a site is evaluated for its significance and we do think it's going to be heavily impacted, and there's no other way for the client or anyone else to kind of change their course, we have to do something called mitigation. So site exam takes out the majority of what we can find, features, artifacts, we do our analysis, and then we go through potentially a data recovery. We try our best to not do data recoveries because it ultimately is not the preservation of the resource, which is what we ultimately would like to see. However, if it does get to that part, there's a memorandum of agreement that gets drafted. There is the mitigation steps, which sometimes means removing the entire site so it doesn't get destroyed. I know in Norwalk, Connecticut, actually there was a Native American village site that was found when I think they were doing the DOT project, maybe? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the what?
Walbridge project?
Yeah, that project. So that they went to a data recovery and they have a ton of really cool things that came out of there. But unfortunately the site is now gone. But that's part of an attempt at mitigation. So now the fun part. So projects that we worked on. I'm trying to give you guys some examples of a variety of things that I've worked on. So one of the projects, this is an urban archaeology kind of setting. Urban archaeology is extremely difficult. Sometimes it's out of my purview and what I've studied because you have so many different layers that happened, and interpreting the site as a whole has been a real challenge. This project in particular was for a new 6-story affordable housing building that happened in downtown Boston. You can actually see it from the highway, what they built on this parking lot. MHC, which is the state agency, wanted a survey done, and we initially started that intensive survey. This was an example of machine trenching, where we actually had an excavator come out and remove asphalt, tried to peel back layers in 10-centimeter intervals. However, with all the fill, we kind of had to run through a bunch of stuff. In that time, we didn't think we were going to find anything of significance. However, in the middle of that area, we found an intact historical sheet mitten, which dated to the late 19th and early 20th century. So it was essentially preserved because of all the fallen timber. So we had grounds to call for a site exam. And the state archaeologists and city archaeologists agreed with us. So this artifact concentration, we tried to figure out exactly who it was associated with, because that was one of our research questions. So we ended up linking it to backlots of these 242 and 252 Harrison Avenue, which at the time, MHC was hoping that this deposit and assemblage pointed to a certain ethnic group. The Chinese and Assyrian community came in quite later in the 20th century, or early 20th century, but this deposit on a whole really pointed to a little bit earlier than that, which was more so the Irish immigrants that came in. And we looked at tax assessors and deed records to try to piece together who this might have belonged to, and we kind of had it more as a conglomerate group, communal trash pit. These are some of the artifacts we found. We have maker's marks on the top left corner. And so this really helped us gauge the timeline as to which records to be looking at. And then we had a lot of intact bottles that came out of it. Again, great at dating for us. And this is more of an example of historic period artifacts. And then the coolest thing was butchered bones. I mean, they're clearly evidently butchered. There's saw marks. So we knew that there was some kind of grocer involved, which there ended up being a grocery store in the same time period right there. Like I said, this never went to data recovery. I'm not quite sure why the state decided to not do so, but it could have been a variety of reasons. So that's an example of urban archaeology. And moving on to Emily Dickinson, our great American poet. Her home is located in Amherst, and Emily Dickinson Museum was trying to generate plans for an HVAC system for the museum. So this property is pretty special because it holds something called a preservation restriction, which is similar to that MOA jargon I was throwing around. That preservation restriction holds specific stipulations that the museum has to participate in some kind of archaeological excavation whenever they have proposed a project. So this was given to the state to review. If they didn't think archaeology was necessary, then that's fine, but they did for this one. Because academically, UMass Amherst Arc Services was conducting field schools for a variety of different projects. They identified the conservatory and a couple other different outbuilding features. One of the things they were trying to find for the longest time is the barn, which was raised in 1920s. So we are doing a site examination right here. As you can see, we didn't find anything in the far west wings where it would have been. There was no evidence of that. However, when we hit trench 3, we actually came across some dry laid stone that was fallen over. It looked like it had been coming out of the wall from somewhere. So we opened up a 1x1 unit, which is an exploratory unit, utilized sometimes to try to catch features and give us a better sense of where we are in space. As we did that, we found this dry laid stone foundation and confirmed that that was the eastern wing of the barn. Because this artifact that's on the left was found just above a lot of they kind of embedded in the stonework. So we knew we were at the right time period for when the barn would have been constructed. And that's a picture of the old barn. So we didn't find any artifacts themselves in this. We found more subsurface features, and then had to kind of interpret it with a limited amount of artifacts that came out of the ground. This is an example, though, of how academic archaeology has actually benefited CRM and vice versa. So we were able to converse with Eric Johnson, who led the cruise, and he had originally thought the barn was a lot more south than it was. So that was really fun to kind of collaborate. This is an example of an archaeological reconnaissance survey. This was just a recent project that was done for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, where the Hampshire and Hampden Canal is part of a much larger canal route that actually exists in Connecticut. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. This one starts at the border of Connecticut and runs into the Connecticut River into Northampton, Mass. So for this project, the community wanted us to do this documentation project, not only to potentially nominate this for the National Register and be part of a larger nomination, but to also provide a planning tool for these towns. Because so much of this canal has been eroded, washed out by flooding events, and then also just in general, a lot of these towns have bulldozed through this to build their downtowns. So myself and my coworker documented this project. The main goals was to create a assessor parcel, so that way they knew what remnants were existing and what were destroyed. Our architectural historian has much better verbiage when it comes to these kinds of projects, which was really helpful. So as you can see, I don't know if many people know what a historic canal really functioned as, but you would have something called a towpath, which is what you see on the right-hand side, and that remnant is very evident. It's a super flat path where a horse and carriage would run the boats and be hooked up to a boat that's sitting in a big prism. And the problem with this canal back in the day was that they used wood to line the prism, not stone. So when it started to deteriorate after a couple of years. Their locks and were all stonework, so we found some of those, and we found the aqueduct. So these have all been repurposed over the years. So this one's repurposed to a railroad trestle. So part of our documentation process was trying to photograph and identify what has been repurposed, what has remained intact. And ultimately, MHC just received this a couple months ago and also agreed with us that this is eligible for the National Register. So now we're moving forward with the nomination at some point. This is something that happened outside of SWCA. This is probably my crowning glory in archaeology. It's the first of its kind. It was a really amazing project to be a part of. We were trying to find the Pilgrim settlement, which they finally did a couple years ago. This was back in 2016. We were excavating on the lot that's above Plymouth Rock. And there's already an identified Native American component to this area, as well as some historic features. So we were just trying to gauge a sense of exactly where this Pilgrim settlement may have been, because at that time they had really no idea if they were going to find anything. So they put some test pits down there just to try to see. However, in the process, we found a cache of organics and personal items that date to the 19th century, completely intact artifacts, and it was kind of a sad story because we figured out that Miss Jackson buried the belongings of her children that had passed before her. So there's been articles written on this, there's been a podcast on this, my professors are still doing work on this, and it's been a really ongoing process. You guys can definitely look it up. It's called the Plymouth Memorial Cache. And so some of the artifacts that we found that help kind of date things are the shell cameo brooch, which has a very specific date range, as did the patent belt that has the date of 1885 on it. These Etruscan-style brooch and earring set were amazing to find, and there's daguerreotype and ambrotypes. There's 4 of them all together, which have the images of what we think are the 2 daughters and the son, which it has been a very somber but interesting kind of story because it truly is an act of private mourning, which is not something common in the Victorian era. It's a very public grieving process. So we found out, the archaeologists went back a couple years ago and they found out that the deposit was actually put in the ground in 3 separate areas, and she did so in her garden. So it's clearly a very private experience. These are held by the Pilgrim Hall Society, so they will be taking care of these artifacts at some point. Very rewarding project I just took part of last year was a wind farm that is going to be providing clean energy to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. This was a confidential project at one point, but they just released information about it, so I'm able to share it with you guys. We did a lot of something called a pedestrian survey, which is surveying large tracts of these turbine areas and looking for traditional cultural places. The reason why this is so impressive and important of a project is it shows an extreme collaborative effort between the tribe and a private consulting firm like ours. So they reached out to us, and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office ran the entire project. And they still are. And it was really special to go with the tribal monitors on their land and have them show us what something means to them. And we were just there as kind of people to help facilitate this process. So it was a project completely led by the tribe, and it will help their community tremendously. And that was in North Dakota. This is a project that just recently happened as well. This is an example of, I don't like to use the word targeted site exam, but this was a specific kind of project that happened via Eversource Energy up in Massachusetts. This is a known site. It had been previously identified by other firms doing excavations on this transmission line, and Eversource has decided, because those poles are not sufficient enough anymore, they need to replace it with a large monopole. So in this process, one of the tribal monitors, Mark Andrews, was on site the entire time, essentially running the show somewhat with us. We have a great relationship with him, but he was able to help tell us what needs to go on, next steps, because this was an unavoidable destruction of this portion of the site. So the Populatic site represents late Archaic, which is about 4,500 years ago, to 200 years ago, which is, Middle Woodland. And these are some of the artifacts that came out of it. We have some projectile points. There's over 1,000 artifacts that were collected just from our excavations. That's not including about, I think, 2 or 3 other times the site's been visited. So in a targeted investigation, we only excavated the area of the proposed monopole. So after we wrote the report, our recommendation was for an avoidance and protection plan, which was already somewhat enacted prior to us visiting the site, as well as archaeological monitoring by both the tribal monitor and ourselves, to ensure that the pole was exactly where it needed to be, because this site is recommended as eligible for the National Register. That being said, avoidance and protection plans are really great tools for clients, and they kind of help mitigate a lot of issues where we have multiple parties that are being involved in different engineering parts of this. We have contractors, so having this one document that really streamlines a lot of things, and we have to teach everyone who comes on site about this. And this is just an example of someone digging one of the units, and then this is what it ultimately looked like. We didn't find any features, which sometimes could indicate, you have a heart feature, but it is known as a village site and a lithic workshop. And I think that is it. So there's a lot, but So anybody have questions or I can answer anything, but yeah.
Did they put the wind turbines on the reservation?
They haven't done so yet. It's a huge process. So they have environmental resources they have to take into consideration for engineering as well as cultural. The cultural component's done. Environmental, I think they're still working on. But I believe this was supposed to happen in the next year or so. Yeah.
Do you have an opinion you're willing to share about recreational metal detectors?
So sure, I can share kind of what I think. So I think in general, I didn't mention at that Hampshire Hampton Canal project, we did utilize LiDAR a lot, so that was really helpful, just as an aside. But metal detecting, I think, has helped identify a lot of different sites. I know Kevin McBride uses it heavily in his work up at UConn, and it's been pretty successful. The only thing I have to say and just reiterate is that truly once you remove something from that area, you lose every piece of information. So if you're on private land and you're kind of doing your own metal detecting, it's super important to get a Google Earth and just drop the pin on where you find stuff, because it ultimately can help researchers or anyone who's in the area to understand what's going on. Yeah, but it has helped find a lot of historic sites. So.
The flip side, are you aware of sites that have been damaged by folks who don't know what they're getting into?
Yeah, and I think that's the whole. That's the whole code of ethics that comes into play. So it's for me, I always advocate to leave things where they are. I mean, that's just in general, personally and professionally, that's what I advocate for. Take as many photos as you want. That's why there's phones nowadays. Document it however. I think it's really rewarding to know that that's preserved for the rest of the future generations. I also think it's super important to report it to the state if you find something. When I worked at MHC, we had a lot of great people call in and say, I found something, whether it really was a lithic or not, and they sent us pictures, whether it was on their land, and it was great because if it was something, we were able to kind of put it in inventory. So if someone wants to build their house on that property, we're like, hey, just, stuff has been found in this area, so it's good for planning and guidance. But I also think, there is a real strict code on the inventory that we hold. MHC has a very tight hold on their resources. We have a special layer just for archaeologists to review with site location. So location, documentation, but then the revealing of that information. There's always going to be, different kinds of people obtaining that.
How about the longest period of time you've been on a site, you personally?
Me personally. So CRM's really fast-paced. So projects in New England, we have some folks up in New Hampshire on this Twin States project that's coming down from the transmission lines from Canada all the way down through New Hampshire into Vermont, all the way down. So that project, they're up there for months at a hit. Me personally, I like to just do the 2-week stints.
Is that what it is? 2 weeks or so?
Yeah,
so
the 10-day rotation is pretty good. So that North Dakota project, I did a 10-day rotation of 10 10-hour days, and then had off 4. So that's a pretty normal time frame for West Coast work, field work. Out here, we do Monday through Friday, and we could be out at a site like that. This 389 line, these guys were out there for 10 solid days.
Just trying to get a handle. Yeah, just curious on when you go to these things. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So some of it just depends on the research design and how much dirt you have to move.
Are the utility companies regulated to look at a site prior to them installing poles?
Yeah, so
Sources of prevalent
Yeah, Eversource and National Grid both have their own kind of standards, but like I said, any project that has state or federal licensing, permitting, or funding, which is usually all those projects, are regulated, so they have to check a box. And in order to check that box, I have to do something like a desktop analysis prior. And the state reviews them too. So that's part of our like consulting business, is doing all that permitting stuff for them. Yeah. And they've been really good about communicating, and they're getting better. Yes.
If I go back to the metal detector for a bit, of which I do own one, but I also had a landscape design and contracting business, and we worked the ground quite extensively.
Right.
One particular house, 1740, probably woods, house, cleared land, pastured land, reverted back to woods again, cleared until machinery working all over the place. I found two, I guess they call them coppers, they're 1 penny, but they're the size of a quarter.
Yeah.
1783 and 1789.
Very cool.
One Vermont and one Connecticut. I could not have found them without the metal detector, but they were on the surface basically.
Yeah.
Of course I took them. Is that considered harm?
So there's different levels to that, I think. So especially for Indigenous groups, it's extremely important to respect their culture. And so for me, anything that people collect that's associated with their occupation, I have a problem with, honestly. That being said, historic artifacts are not as heavily, they're associated with European occupation. So that's not to say I would take those, but if you're on private land, I can say you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, you knew it was a 17th century home and you took the coins that were there, but they really didn't have much context because you guys ended up excavating whatever was there. So there's a fine line to walk, is what I want to say.
All right, if I can flip that to American Indians, I have found many spear tips, projectile points, whatever, just walking and seeing them lie on the ground. Is that bad to take them? And should they be reported to someone?
So I would advocate for reporting them. If you, this kind of gets into a little bit more of a contentious subject with some people, but I would say the smartest thing to do is definitely convenience them. So that means drop a point wherever you are, coordinates. If your phone has a coordinate, drop a coordinate, because you don't know if that point has been deposited at a later date. You don't, if it's surface level, it's likely moved from where the site was, but there's likely a site nearby. Some people also, they were hunters, and they are hunters, and so if they drop a point, then maybe that's where it landed.
Or miss their game.
Or missed.
Or
So
deer still ran off
it just
into the
shows you that
woods.
people were, and people are and were here utilizing these objects. So again, for me, I can't speak because I am not American Indian. However, the indigenous groups that I've worked with would advocate heavily for it to be reported and left where it is. And I do think that this is something that the new generation of archaeologists are trying to encourage people to do. Like I said, phones exist for a reason. These artifacts were taken out of a context that we're able to interpret. Tribal monitor was present interpreting the site. Avocationally, out west, you're on cattle ranches and rangelands, and things are literally where cows are taking a poop. So they've just been sitting there for so long that I know I've talked to a bunch of ranchers about this, and they actually leave stuff where it is because it's just going to continue to sit there, and it's really interesting to be able to walk around and study this too. So I personally advocate for not removing things. However, if you have removed it and you are analyzing it, it would be great to report it to, we have avocational collector reports that kind of document everything people have found in the past. There's a lot of reports at the state level that have taken all of this material that people have collected, whether it's from a certain region, and kind of source the lithic material. That's really important to know. Where are they getting this material from? So there have been a lot of benefits to avocational collecting, but the flip side is I try in the future to not advocate for that. But I have seen benefits to studying these collections as well.
Have you worked with any Native groups that think that laws should be changed surrounding like repatriating these artifacts, even if it is on private land?
Yeah, I mean, repatriation is a huge endeavor that's been tried. I mean, it's feel like this process has been stonewalled quite a bit, just pushback from different parties. Repatriation has thankfully not happened to me quite yet, because I know it's a very arduous process for a lot of different reasons. I have worked with human remains before on the state level and at a field school, and the repatriation process, even for collections that are like stuck in these basements for a while, it's a really difficult one for a lot of different reasons, as you can imagine, whether it's burial goods or actual remains themselves. But yes, I have worked with, and I've also worked with Indigenous groups that are a little wary of archaeology and what it can do for their community. So that's also something that, as an upcoming archaeologist in this field, like I really want to do a better job of, and I know a bunch of my colleagues try to do the same, trying to flip the narrative on it and what it can do. Yes.
I came from Lawton, Connecticut, where I worked with the Land Trust, and the southeastern Connecticut landscape has a lot of very curious sound structures, and a wide range of opinions about everything goes back to Indigenous people. None of it does, and I have not run into very many people that sound very authoritative about it.
Mm-hmm.
Marco Starr is he's a photographer from, I believe, Stonington. He has a nice book. It talks very little about what he thinks they are, but there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff out there. Do you have any guidance or advice for me to be able to learn more about this?
Yes, I can give you a book. I just have to look it up because I can't remember the name. We came across this in one of our projects when they were trying to build a solar array up in Pelham, Massachusetts. Certain Indigenous groups have different opinions on these stone structures, as does the state level, and it is, again, a very controversial kind of topic. So I really won't say my opinion on it. However, I have a good book for you to read that I was given. I can recommend it to you. That kind of interprets these landscapes fairly, I'd say.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about the avocational collectors reports? And it sounds like everything.
Oh yeah.
Like there's not anything equivalent to like an iNaturalist for archaeology, and probably for a lot of good reasons. Like everything goes through the state office.
Yeah, so the State Historic Preservation Office, there's state archaeologists.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. I think those reports should be public record because they sit on the National Register shelves, at least at the MHC. But they essentially, they're really old though. They're not like extremely informative, but they do synthesize a lot of the data that these collectors had that are, I think most of that's Massachusetts based, so I don't know Connecticut-wise what they have. In general though, there's a lot of different reference books for, projectile points, not projectile points, lithics in general. And kind of, like, I think the most important part is the resources. Some of these resources are coming from as far south as like Florida, some are coming from out west. So it's really interesting to see sometimes if those pop up on sites. I mean, the two common materials here are rhyolite and quartz, which are really difficult to work. So I'm extremely amazed when we find points like this because they're such hard raw materials to work with. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
You sound like you are speaking from experience. Have you ever tried?
Oh my, yes, and a cup in hand. Yeah, they had a couple of flint knapping classes, because Eric Johnson, who I keep mentioning, he is an archaeologist, North American archaeologist at UMass Amherst, and he still does, I think. He's kind of retired now, but he used to do flint knapping classes. So, using antlers and, what else did he use? He did all the traditional kind of knapping tools, which was really cool, but he used obsidian, which is like that glass-like material, and it was extremely sharp. Like they don't lie when they say that thing can really cut you, and I think a bunch of us cut our hands. So, but yeah, it's really rewarding because that really shows you. I'm not a lithics expert by any means, but it does help you in your analysis because there's different stages of production, obviously. So based on the stage that you're at, it was cool seeing how something flakes off a core, like what that looks like, or what debitage looks like. So that was a really good hands-on experience of just the basics of what you can find.
Did people use obsidian here? I had somebody tell me that there was only out.
Yeah, there's outcrops out west. Yeah, it's in California, that's all we found. So yeah.
You have an all-time favorite one you've done? Is there anyone that stands out that you,
The project.
a project, anything that really kind of, wow, this was unbelievable?
I've been super lucky with clearly all these, but I do think the memorial cache has been my favorite. I mean, it's been my baby of writing and whatnot, and it's such a personal connection. I mean, we really tagged it to one family, and it was in a kind of a, sometimes I get emotional about it, my coworker and I that found it, and it's just a really great reminder that you just really don't know what's out there, and it was such a personal experience essentially it was a burial of people's personal items. I mean, we found a lock of hair on it. At first we thought it was a burial, and we're like, oh, but you have to stop digging at that point. But it was such a very personal connection. It was almost like we were supposed to find this during excavations, and as a undergrad, or a graduate student, it was a really rewarding experience to be able to tell that story. Because ultimately, a lot of these sites, we really don't know the exact. I mean, it's really cool to see a thumbprint on a ceramic, or know that the napper was doing this while someone was right next to them doing that. But that we could actually tag to someone, and so that was pretty impressive. And we found the descendants of that family.
Wow,
So
very cool.
they live in Florida.
Where was it?
Yeah.
You said there was a podcast on there?
Yeah. It's on Sapiens, I think. But it's really good because that podcast has my professors speaking on it. It has the experience of the other archaeologists who dug up the rest of that and excavated the remaining half of this memorial cache. And I just want to say that my colleague and I were 100% right about what happened on this site and what it looked like and where she buried it, and no one believed us until they did the running year of it. So my professor is pretty pumped about that. But yeah, there's a ton of different articles that have been written on it too. So really a great one.
If you do small test pits,
Mhm.
what would you think the percentage of hit and miss
Oh yeah.
would be? A foot over?
Yeah, it's quite boring out there in the field a lot. Hit and miss, good question actually. We do the research design for, say, transmission pole, usually where the pole location goes in cardinal directions. That's just standard in an interval. That's usually to cover where the pole will go itself. We have work pad areas, so we do test the work pad too. So the interval testing is to do exactly what you're saying, is to try to cover all these areas. If you move a test pit over, you're right, sometimes you could miss something, sometimes you cannot, but this kind of methodology has been approved by the state and the TIPOs usually, so if they don't have a problem with it, then we kind of go ahead with it. Also, landforms, environmental setting and geomorphology is a really awesome kind of science. However, my coworker does that, she's her PhD in it, but I personally can only read a landform and see if it's sensitive. We're all humans here, so if you think about it in one way or another, if there's an existing waterway that has been around and hasn't been dammed or rerouted, then usually there's a likelihood someone decided that they wanted to build a camp there or live there seasonally. So there's a multitude of factors that go into this research design to kind of ensure that we don't miss anything. When we do these transmission line projects, my coworker and I are allowed to add in test pits. So we do all this desktop analysis. However, and we do drones would be a really cool thing to have, but it's not always financially feasible to kind of run these lines. But if him and I are walking and we see a great landform, we will add test pits in there. And the state has no problem with that. So, and that has actually caught a site. We found a pretty large site on the top of a hill that we missed while we were doing our computer analysis. So in the field, there is wiggle room for catching kind of quote unquote like computer mistakes. But there's a whole like kind of science to how there's a couple factors we factor in when we do our sensitivity assessment. Especially for like a linear project like that one. Well,
All right, well, thank you, Nadia.
no problem. Hopefully it's helpful.